What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe show. As always, I'd like to say you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and the solution for someone's problem. And remember, this is the home of Epic Conversations, and I'm the host of Epic Conversations and 2018 Innovation Award winner given out by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association. And you know how I always like to have new friends on the Dr. Vibe show, and I have two more here tonight. And who are they? They are Laura Morgan Roberts and Anthony J. Mayo. They are two out of three individuals that have just put out a serious book. And I'm just going to put it up right here. And when I put it up, folks, you will see how serious. And you see the title, Race, Work, and Leadership, New Perspectives on the Black Experience. And they're going to share some of this great book with you tonight. They were two out of the three editors. The other editor is David A. Thomas, so I didn't want to leave his name out of it. So welcome, both of you. How are you both this?
Doing well, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. I could read your backgrounds, and I should, because people go, who are these people? So let me just read a little bit of background first. So first, as we always do on the Dr. Vibe show, ladies first. So Ms. Roberts is a professor of practice at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business and a visiting scholar at Harvard Business School's Gender Initiative. A thought leader in diversity, inclusion, authenticity, and identity development. She is a co-editor of Positive Identities and Organizations and Positive Organization in a Global Society, and author of numerous research articles, teaching cases, and practitioner-oriented tools, including influential Harvard Business Review articles. And Mr. Mayo, not to be left out, is the Thomas S. Murphy Senior Lecturer of Business Administration in the Organizational Behavior Unit of Harvard Business School. With Newton Noria, he is the co-author of In Their Time and Paths to Power, both published by Harvard Business Review Press. So I like to first say great bios, but a little background. So Laura, tell us a little bit about yourself other than that great bio.
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up in Gary, Indiana, and growing up in Gary, Indiana in the 1980s, we were very aware of the impact of a changing economy on workforce opportunities and the different kinds of economic and racial disparities that resulted from that. I've been passionate about diversity and inclusion in the workforce ever since. And so I was fortunate. I was one of those people who went to college and kind of knew what I was interested in and what I wanted to do, and was able to continue to grow and develop in this path, though it still took a bit of time to finally be able to do the work that led to our edited volume, Race, Work, and Leadership. But really excited about having the opportunity to participate in conversations such as this about a topic that has just become increasingly important over time, and not less so.
Thank you for a little bit about that background. And Tony, a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. So I'm from New Hampshire, actually French Canadian.
Hey! Canuck! All right, Canuck.
Our ancestors are from Quebec, I should say. And so first generation to go to college, grew up in a lower middle class family. And so part of my coming to this research is actually through the book with Dean Noria, which is Path to Power, looking at how insiders and outsiders shaped business leadership. And I've always, coming from a different background, coming from a lower socioeconomic background, felt like an outsider. So always sort of looking in, having a foot in two worlds, the world that I'm in academia at Harvard, and then the world that I grew up in, and trying to reconcile both of those. And having the opportunity to work on this project with Laura has been an absolute treat to dive into the research, to understand the experiences, and to be a part and a voice for the cause.
Excellent. How did this come together? Because did you each one of you know each other before this project?
Well, we did, but this was our first opportunity to work together. So
Okay.
I served on the faculty of Harvard Business School. It was actually my first job post PhD. So I was here on faculty for about 7 years, and then decided to relocate to Atlanta, and was invited to come back to HBS as a research affiliate, specifically to work on this particular project. And was really excited to have the opportunity to work with Tony. We were here around the same time, but we've never gotten a chance to collaborate before this.
Yeah. So this project actually stemmed from the 50th anniversary of the celebration of the African American Student Union at Harvard Business School. So that was formed in 1968, and in 2018, Dean Nithanoria asked me and some of my colleagues to spearhead the efforts to celebrate this initiative. And as part of that celebration, yes, we wanted to have a celebration, we wanted to have a documentary, we wanted to have a library exhibit, but we also wanted to have a line in the sand and say, okay, what's the latest research about race? What's going on? What do we know? What's from the past that we should carry forward? What should we leave behind? And I knew we needed somebody who was a scholar on race. And I reached out to Laura and I said, hey, do you want to join me on this adventure? And she said, yes, right away. And it's been a great collaboration for the last few years to work together.
So I love success stories. How long did it take from that time you said, Laura, yes, to getting to the point where we're this?
Right. So that would have been fall of 2016.
Yeah. Almost 3 years.
So almost 3 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe this might be like exactly 3 years.
Yeah, it's exactly 3 years.
I feel like it was October.
Yeah.
2016. Nice. But we first put out the call for submissions to the book in the fall, around October of 2017. So 2 years.
2 years to get the book.
To get the book.
We started talking about it in 2016 and actually had a conference to,
that's right. We
get
did.
some ideas, get some young scholars, some prominent scholars who study race to say, hey, we're thinking about this book. We're thinking about this conference. What should we talk about? What are the latest topics? So we actually did a bunch of pre-research before we did the actual research.
That's right, we did. Because it was really important to us to engage a wide range of thought leaders who have been considering these questions about race and who have been courageous enough in their own research to center the Black experience. That's something that is quite rare even today in the 21st century, in management and organizational studies in particular. People might...
I just want to interrupt. Why do you feel that is still
Why
rare?
is it still rare? One of the ways that I think about it is, in the land of diversity and inclusion conversations where we've become more and more accustomed to thinking and talking about authenticity and belonging and diverse perspectives and ideas, cognitive dimensions of diversity, race and racial inequality is the hottest place in the fire. It's where the heat and the intensity of long-standing differences, disparities, inequitable distribution of resources was literally baked into the foundation of the Americas and has continued to persist in terms of creating, for lack of a better word, an unequal playing field for folks of different racial backgrounds. So you can talk about cognitive diversity without having to question or challenge structures, cultures, practices, a myth of meritocracy. But when race enters the conversation, you, by extension, have to start to consider the power dynamics and the structural inequalities that, again, were initiated hundreds and hundreds of years ago and have had a deleterious impact over time. So people shy away from it, and researchers shy away from it. And we wanted to create a space where researchers who are very thoughtful and passionate about this work could let their voices be heard, and where we could share and learn from one another.
Right.
Tony, I want to ask you, how much work did this take amongst all three? Because this is not light reading. This is a lot of work.
Yeah. No.
And also my other conversation piece, was it easy to get contributors to this wonderful work?
Yeah, it was. The call for papers was pretty straightforward, and we had a lot of people come forward that wanted to be part of the conversation. So that wasn't difficult. And one of the other challenges when you're writing about race is a lot of times the numbers, particularly in the work that we were doing, which was looking at professionals, looking at people in professional work settings, the numbers are often pretty small. So when you're trying to draw some conclusions from those numbers, a lot of publications want big data sets, want big numbers, and the book has some big data sets. It has a data set of the Black graduates of Harvard Business School that's based on 1,400 professionals that have graduated, and also a similar group from Harvard Law School. But it also has stories of individuals and the individual experience of being Black at work, and what is that like. And so this book is an opportunity to bring both the heavy data set together as well as the individual stories. And so it was great, working on this book. And when Laura asked me to be a co-editor, I was like, I don't know, do I have anything I can contribute to it? And she's like, yes, you can. And so we ended up being a good partnership in terms of, doing any time you do an edited book, a lot of it is structure and planning and feedback and editing and re-editing. And I'm pretty good with that stuff. So, we had a good partnership there.
I mean, and the other piece was trying to put ourselves in the reader's shoes.
Yeah.
We said, what if I were a manager who never really thought about these issues? What if I'm somebody who's not an academic, but I want to pick up this book? I want to understand more fully what the experiences are of people from diverse racial backgrounds in my organization. And I want some tools. Give me some insights and tips that can help me. If I'm an underrepresented minority, how can I navigate this path more easily? If I'm in the majority group, if I have a position of power, how can I use my power for good? How can I take these insights and then try to create more opportunities or enhance the culture of my organization to benefit them? So, I think a lot of our editorial process was more elaborate than it might if we were just saying, okay, this is an academic book. Did they check all those boxes? We wanted to be able to translate the research findings into action steps.
Yeah.
Well, before we delve really into the topic, I want to get the feeling both of you shared when you held a finished copy.
Oh gosh.
You should talk about the real lifelong experience for you.
Which part? The lifelong experience?
Getting to this point.
It's definitely been, I've been one of those academics who had the experiences of being advised at different points in my career to not play up my interest in race, but kind of frame it and couch it in terms of some more palatable frameworks that people could feel like they generalized more, or they might feel a little less intense. So I felt like I was always writing about race, but even in many of my papers that are inspired by insights about race, I'm not naming race as much. I'm talking about identities more broadly and more generally. So this was kind of like a moment for me to say, yeah, I stand behind this. I'm invested in this. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I'm really passionate about it. And I want to have an explicit conversation. So there was that piece of it. When I held the book, it by happenstance came while I was on my summer break. And so I went to the beach with the book and sat down with the book and watched the sunset as a way of just kind of marking this accomplishment.
Yeah.
Tony?
Yes, for me, I've written a few books, and this was probably, and I didn't read, I was the editor on this one, so contributed some chapters, but did not write the whole thing. But this was probably the hardest book that I've worked on, but the most rewarding in terms of, and so for me, the response that the book has received and the contribution that it's making and the opportunity for contributors to be published and get really important work out, I was super proud of being part of that and being part of the team that actually got this to the finish line. And even though it was a 3-year process, that's actually pretty quick for an edited volume. Yes. In the academic world, by the time we did the call for papers and the book came out, it was 2 years. That's lightning speed. And we really wanted this to come out. And also sort of coming out in this, it's interesting in 2019 juxtaposed to 1619 and having that as the publication date and having this significant moment in time for this issue is something we didn't plan, but I'm glad that it worked out this way.
Yeah, I mean, we also have talked about from a point of contrast, when we first started this project in 2016.
Yeah.
Just the political climate in the U.S. was different.
Yeah.
So there were many questions floating around about whether or not race was still relevant.
Do you even need this
book?
we
need this book?
Yeah.
Do we need this conversation?
Post-racial society.
No one's asking those questions right now.
Won't go there.
No.
Hey.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we talk about what's happening present in the world of race work and leadership, can you give our viewers and listeners a historical perspective on this subject in American history?
Well, we can anchor on 1619.
Sure.
One of the ways that I like to invite people into a historical perspective is through the lens of the business case for diversity. So we today approach this business case for diversity as if we need to advocate for the presence of diversity in the workforce. But in fact, that's a bit of a farce because the workforce has always been diverse. And there were many people, millions of people who were involved in the exploitation of unpaid labor of people of African descent. For hundreds of years. When we look at the span of history, even the United States, we're talking about race, work, and leadership. We've always had the intersections of race and work. The question has been about racial integration and inclusion in positions of leadership. So where are we now in the span of that long history? How are we starting to gain traction? Even after having an African descended president for 8 years, what do our largest corporations look like with respect to the diversity in their senior leadership, the diversity on their boards? And the data suggests that it's in fact waning. So the peak was in 2002. And in the years hence, the numbers have declined, whereas now there are three
African-American CEOs of Fortune 500 companies.
Yeah. And not one is a woman. And so it's sobering to think about all of this through the lens of historical context. But at the same time, we can also acknowledge that there is greater access. And so we have to think about how to change organizations so that they'll be more receptive to racial diversity and leadership, particularly having African Americans and Black people in positions of leadership.
Tony, anything you want to add on to that comment?
I think the other historical lens for us, because this stemmed out of the 50th anniversary of the formation of the African American Student Union, was sort of look at what has changed in the last 50 years. So if we look at what was the landscape for the graduates of Harvard Business School, for Harvard Law School, how has that changed over time? How is that, in many ways, oftentimes we talk about the insider and the outsider path to leadership. And if you were a woman, if you were a person of color in the 20th century, you often had an outsider path to access. You didn't necessarily have the inside track. And so that outsider track was often a situation that meant that if you looked at the people who had become successful, they had these professional credentials that far outweighed their white counterparts. They had a heavy focus on perseverance. By that we mean entrepreneurship, forging their own way, having this strong sense of resilience, and having these professional connections that help support success. So those things were true in 50 years ago, and they're still true today. So part of our research was like, okay, what's changed? What hasn't changed? That's just looking at 50 years, never mind the 400 years.
Right.
But looking at those 50 years, yes, there's some access that changed, there's some opportunities that change, but the lived experience is often quite similar, and that's unfortunate. And so we wanted to understand, what is different, what can be different, what can individuals do, what can companies do.
Okay. I'm going to move it to current day existence, and something that popped in my mind. What effect has affirmative action had on race, work, and leadership in America?
Yeah. Well, there's compelling data that indicates that the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action have been white women. There's also been a pretty pronounced backlash against affirmative action that has happened sort of at the coffee station, but also in the courtrooms. And so even when I was in college, went to University of Virginia undergrad, went to University of Michigan grad school, both state schools, both predominantly white institutions. Both of them during the 90s were very assertive in recruiting African American students and other underrepresented groups. And the University of Michigan was the subject of a huge lawsuit shortly after I left. I think the year after I left. So I think, for the impact of affirmative action, we showed, for instance, in our career database that part of the pipeline of bringing more African American students into Harvard Business School was a function of affirmative action policies that provided more access to higher education and then therefore positioned them to attend HBS or HLS or many other grad schools and degrees. And then, they have that additional credential to be able to take into the workforce and navigate their careers or become entrepreneurs and business owners in their own right. So we definitely witnessed and observed how affirmative action policies did benefit people who were on that outsider path.
Yeah. Because
the credentialing was key. We also found two things. The credentialing isn't enough. Just because you have the credentials doesn't mean that you're going to get selected or promoted to the more senior leadership positions. Right. So that's part one. And then part two, that the backlash against affirmative action has been so strong and pronounced that younger African Americans cannot expect to have the same kinds of opportunities and receptivity that African Americans 20, 30 years ago would have had.
When you hear that, Tony, how does that make you feel about the state of leadership in America?
We were just talking about this earlier about the the book and how does it make it feel? On the one hand, the book and the research and what we found, you can be very frustrated by it. You can sort of look at it and say, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, although it feels like 2 steps back lately in the context that we're living in. So you can feel that sense of frustration, but you also have this feel of hope, this feel of aspiration, this sense of, looking at the individuals that we studied, how they were able to transcend the dynamics in which they've had to work. And so you can celebrate that story too. So there's this hopeful story, this aspirational story, this admiration story, but there's also this story of frustration and this concern with the structural barriers there and the attitudinal barriers and some of the ignorance. And so I think Laura talked about white women being the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action. It's interesting. We did a survey of graduates, Black and white graduates of Harvard Business School, and the white women, less than 2% felt they benefited at all from that, even though they were the largest beneficiaries. And so just this lack of recognition that there is a collective rising of tides there, and it's not benefiting one group over the other necessarily, is just not, people don't recognize that, and that, so there's a bit of frustration with that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Lost my thought.
Okay.
I'll come back to it.
Yeah.
I'll come back to it.
Okay, when you get it back,
I'll get it back. I'll come back.
Before we went live, there was definitely a subject that I wanted both of you to address.
Yeah.
It's addressed in the book and also from your experiences doing research. I call it the D&I, diversity and inclusion. Like if affirmative action was a hot conversation piece a number of years ago, diversity and inclusion are in it now. Can you share with our audience what the contributors had to share about diversity and inclusion, and also what are your thoughts about the D&I in the leadership world these days?
Yeah, we did. So one piece, and this is bridging from your previous question, is what we offer for Black professionals is validation, which is key. So in the broader D&I conversations where people are shying away from talking explicitly about race or having race-targeted programs and offerings, there's still individuals who are suffering from experiences of isolation, inauthenticity, the pressure to be a cultural ambassador, feeling like they have to represent and do the extra work, carry the load of being the unofficial D&I agents within their organizations. And those roles and responsibilities tend to fall disproportionately on people of color in organizations. They kind of take up that mantle and try to lead change from the middle around these areas of diversity and inclusion. And so, but as they're doing that, they're also still, like I said, feeling this burden of isolation. And so when they read our book, one of the things that I'm hearing when I get like LinkedIn messages from people that I've never met who are like all over the country in different industries and sectors saying like, I read the book or I listened to the podcast and thank you so much for speaking my truth. I've lived these dynamics that you're talking about. You put it into words. And so that's really powerful for people to know this is not just in my head, but this is a shared experience and something's happening here. And then that informs the way that they choose to show up in trying to lead D&I from the middle. We also had some really important insights, critical insights about what senior executives are doing in the D&I space. Tony, can speak to that.
So I think that the other thing that we saw in sort of understanding the landscape as well was there's been over the years more of a homogenization of diversity and inclusion, and that everybody's diverse and the tent is pretty big and everybody can be in that. And when you do that, it sort of obfuscates the talk about the Black experience. And so partly, when it's fine to talk about broad levels of diversity and inclusion programs, but you can't do that at the expense of having meaningful conversations about the Black experience. And partly what we wanted to do is to have that conversation about the Black experience. And so what can organizations do to sort of change the needle a little bit and take the emotional burden or the emotional tax off of the underrepresented minority, who has to both, think about, okay, what are the diversity initiatives I should be responsible for, and I actually have to do my real job. And so you're wearing these two hats, and that's not a real level playing field. And so creating a context where that's a shared burden, or it shouldn't be a burden, but a shared responsibility, a shared responsibility in the organization about promoting a diverse and inclusive environment, to create a psychologically safe space where people can actually speak and have conversations about race. One of the reasons why there's this homogenization and this difficulty is that, as Laura said earlier in this session with you, is that it's a really hot topic and people want to stay away from that. And so they're worried that, if we have these conversations about race, I'm going to say something wrong, or I'm going to be branded a racist, or I will be clumsy in how I speak. And so creating a context where you can engage in these types of conversations, it can be psychologically safe. You can try to separate intent and impact and try to understand, each other's side by having the sense of empathy, and creating that context is particularly important.
Right. And it's important. I think you may have said this, so sorry if I'm repeating, but that the people in power need to take the responsibility for leading that and leading those conversations. This point is just top of mind because this afternoon when I was teaching a group of executives, one woman said, look, I'm kind of the only, and when these conversations come up in my organization, then stuff starts coming out that I really wish I didn't even know that people thought. So I said, well, it's not on you to have to hold the space to facilitate those conversations and make sure they're productive.
Right.
Instituting all of the norms around psychological safety and, just a respect for human dignity needs to come from the senior leadership, which more often than not tends to be in the majority or dominant groups. Because she was feeling the burden to manage the quality of the conversation and also manage her own feelings about hearing other people express their feelings and their discomfort around race. And I just, feel like that's too much for one person to have to carry.
I got a question from our YouTube side, Claude Diamond, and he's asking both of you, do you both feel affirmative action is still necessary?
Yes.
Why? And I'm not saying, but so what is your reasoning for you being in unity in regards to your answer there? That was well done, by the way. The look and the yes, well done. Not scripted.
Not at all. Not at all.
I just think that, it hasn't been a level playing field. If you sort of look at who gets access to opportunities, who's making the hiring decisions, one of the things that we often talk about is performance versus potential. And a lot of times, if you're in an underrepresented group, maybe you don't have the track record, maybe you don't have that performance that you can draw on, and so you're drawing on potential. But when we make hiring decisions, we often hire people that whose experiences we know, who might be more like us, intentionally or unintentionally, we're making decisions that actually constrict who has access to opportunity, who gets those stretch assignments. So whoever gets that stretch assignment, who gets that new opportunity, who gets a chance to flex themselves a little bit, that's what you need. You need new experiences. You need somebody in your corner to back you up. And if we left this to chance, people are going to hire people like themselves. It's just not going to necessarily be a situation. To me, it hasn't been a fair playing field. It still isn't a fair playing field. We're not in a post-racial society. A lot of people say, why are you even talking about this? Just treat everybody equally and it's going to be fine. That's just not the reality of the way the numbers are playing out and who are in positions of power.
Mm-hmm.
And Claude follows up, and I think you've answered this with your just sharing right now, Tony. He's saying, aren't we ready in 2020 to judge people based on merit?
I love that question. It's always an aspiration. I don't think that attention to diversity undermines a focus or emphasis on merit. It's about being more intentional and identifying a wider range of people who merit consideration, inclusion, and advancement. So that I think that's one important piece to consider. I mean, you often hear the trope, oh, we just can't find anybody, so therefore there must not be enough qualified people, and that's why we don't have the kind of representation that we have. When in fact it's that our implicit yet pervasive biases keep us focusing on selecting from the pools in which we always tend to fish. And so if you're always going to the same, not pool, pond. So if you're always going to, you won't get any in the pool, but if you're always going, maybe that's the point.
I like you, Laura. I like you. I gotta come to your lectures. I gotta come to some of your lectures, Laura. You're on point.
But you know, the other thing that I would add, just from a socially conscious standpoint, you know, we try to have these conversations about race in the workplace as though we all of a sudden can become colorblind, and we put on these blinders and we don't see race because we've entered into this pristine space called work, organization, and now we focus on merit, and that is all. But it's permeable. So a few days ago, when a young Black woman is sitting in her apartment playing a video game with her nephew and gets shot by a police officer in Fort Worth, killed for sitting in her apartment playing a video game, it's hard to argue that people don't see race until one can show a similar set of comparable errors that professionals are making in their line of duty or in their line of responsibility that would equally expose or harm a group of, say, white people, not brown people. So, I mean, I think part of what we do whenever we bring up the conversations about race, work, and leadership is say, hey, we can't just talk about what happens at work as if the clock starts at 9, the clock stops at 5, and during these 8 hours, we can all turn off any focus and attention to race. When we look at what's happening in our society, there are a number of deeply troubling patterns of behavior that are continuing to disadvantage entire communities of people and make it more difficult for them to survive and to have access to the same kinds of opportunities down the road.
Good stuff.
Who is this 8-year-old going to be in 10, 15 years when he's entering the workforce after he's had this kind of traumatic experience? And multiply that by hundreds. And then, try to come up with an argument about how people can just shut off their racial experiences when they show up to work. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. We bring all aspects of our experiences, our lives, our personal and shared histories together when we work together at the table. It's only because Tony and I are able to have these kinds of conversations in a very comfortable way where he's not feeling attacked, I'm not feeling judged. Yeah. We're just talking and sharing. That's where we're able to collaborate and learn and explore together. But we wouldn't be able to do this work together if we couldn't acknowledge what's happening in the broader context.
Right.
Excellent. Luke, who's from Windsor, Ontario, Canada,
right.
said, he says, fellow Canuck to Tony, and he says, we talk about affirmative action. He says, I think it's necessary, far from ideal, but necessary.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, well stated. Stated.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the effect of wealth gap, mass incarceration in regards to race, work, and leadership. What are your thoughts on that when it comes to those two issues and race, work, and leadership?
Well, we know that educational disparities correspond with the wealth gap. Look at the rising costs of college education today.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
How can we argue for equal access, from anyone who comes from an impoverished background, or I would say for many of the Black professionals in our book, a middle class background, where if you don't qualify for any kinds of their children will not qualify for any kinds of first generation funds for educational access or opportunities. They will be responsible for funding their children's college educations. So part of the dynamic with the wealth gap is showing that even though African Americans are pursuing college education at relatively higher rates, so a greater percentage of African Americans within the African American population go to college versus percentage of whites within the entire white population. So it's not that African Americans are not pursuing or valuing higher education, but when the cost of education and the cost of housing continues to escalate, they don't have the same reservoir of resources. They don't have a grandmother or a grandfather who can help to kick in and subsidize some of the college tuition and the education. And so it's difficult to imagine how you would gain traction in increasing your wealth across generations. I know that's a little bit sophisticated because I'm weaving together different pieces of the puzzle, but I think when we talk about the wealth gap, we are often focusing on what's happening to the individuals who are most impoverished. And that's clear. What I also think we need to focus on, based on the data in our book, is what's happening to the shrinking middle class and how it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to pass on better opportunities to their children than the ones that they were able to have for themselves. I think the data shows by 2050 that the average wealth for African American families will be zero.
Yep.
And so that's a scary, sobering thought. And you're like, how can that happen when we're looking at all these Harvard Business School grads, all these Harvard Law grads, and everything else? Well, it's the shrinking middle class and even the shrinking upper middle class that would explain a lot of that.
Go ahead.
The other thing that we saw in our interviews with graduates, even from graduates from elite institutions, they have constrained opportunities. They have forced constraints because they have to think about, okay, I need to take this job for a certain level of security because I'm supporting a broader network of people. A lot of people are counting on me. It may be the first person in the family that's going to graduate school or the second person, and there's an extended family of individuals whom that person is helping to support. And so their choices that they're making are constrained versus the choices that other individuals that have a safety net that they can rely on to make other choices, to go into this field or that field, or to pursue something. And so some of the individuals that we talked with, they called this the black tax, and people use that term for other things. But one of the things that they said is that, look, this is the tax that it's a generational tax that I've got to support my family or my siblings or this aunt or uncle. And so the choices that I'm making are forcing me to think about, okay, why, if I take this opportunity, will that give me the greatest latitude to help this extended family? If I'm doing that, then I'm not necessarily accumulating the wealth on my own for my descendants. And so it creates this self-perpetuating system that we're in, and that's why you get to zero.
Right. And to add on to that, mass incarceration. Why can't the extended family members take care of and provide for themselves? That's where part of the mass incarceration piece fits in as well, in terms of having African American communities being disproportionately penalized, charged with similar crimes and prosecuted at a higher rate with longer sentencing, more harsh and severe consequences for such, and then post-incarceration having limited employment opportunities. So those who have escaped the school to prison pipeline are carrying the burdens of providing for and supporting a broader community as well.
Excellent. It's interesting, and you're talking there. And one of the things that really caught me in the book, there was one chapter about black ceiling, glass
Yeah.
ceiling, but then
Yeah.
also the glass cliff.
Mm.
I had never heard about the glass cliff. So what can you tell us? I thought it was fascinating. I'd love you to explain, because I think most of us know the glass ceiling, and you were speaking over the last few minutes about more and more African Americans having limited opportunities even to go to school. But then the ones that graduate,
Mm-hmm.
they're facing a glass ceiling, but also a glass cliff. Could you explain?
Mm. So basically, what that term refers to is risky opportunity. So basically, it's in a couple of the authors in the book write about the disproportionate number of African American CEOs and executives who are given opportunities that are on the precipice of collapse. That this business situation may be going downhill, so we'll give it to somebody. If they succeed, great. Nobody could have succeeded. It's just a huge success. If they fail, they're going to fail anyway. And so you get credit, if you will, for giving this opportunity to somebody who may be a diverse candidate, but you don't have a lot of faith or hope that that's going to actually transcend into something else. And so this glass cliff situation is that a lot of African Americans, when they're given these straight opportunities, they're not giving the plum assignment that's going to be let's on this high trajectory. They're given this thing on the precipice of decline, and not necessarily set up for success in that situation.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Were there common themes that you saw throughout the writings?
So there's themes of both, from the individual experience about resilience, about having this strong sense of yourself, having this robust sense of your identity. So there's this transcendent story of, yes, there's lots of challenges in sort of navigating the competitive landscape, navigating the work environment. And so there's those stories that are affirming. But there's also the parallel story of all of these obstacles that we've talked about, and these barriers and the sort of systemic issues that are going on there.
Mm-hmm. There's a desire and an ambition to lead.
Yes.
So I guess, one of the things we could say is, what didn't we hear?
Yeah.
We didn't hear people say, I give up.
Yeah.
Or, I don't even want to lead. I'm not even trying anymore. What we hear people saying is, I want my leadership. I want my leadership to be respected. I want to grow. I want a safe space to grow. I'm seeking supportive developmental relationships so that I can learn and grow and improve and take on more significant leadership roles and responsibilities. And I think that is pretty remarkable. Just to recognize and acknowledge that fire of the human spirit that says, in spite of all of these obstacles, I'm not going to quit. I'm going to keep finding a way to grow stronger and to make a difference and to have a positive impact. One way or another, I'm going to lead. And I think maybe that would be our next book. is to capture even more of those stories of leadership impact and the ways that they're manifesting.
So Luke is saying, in regards to the glass cliff reference, he says, quote, the ship is sinking. You can be the captain now.
That's another way of looking at it. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And if you can turn it around, we'll all celebrate together. Didn't we make a great choice?
Yes.
We were. But if you don't, it's fascinating research by a professor at Duke, Ashley Rosette. And this is one example that always sticks with people. It talks about how the media reports differently after football games when the quarterback is black and the quarterback is white. So if there's a black quarterback and the team wins, they write about what the team did well. If it's a white quarterback and the team wins, they write much more about what the quarterback did and how smart and wise the quarterback is. Now, if the team loses glass cliff situation, then the article with the white quarterback talks about how the situation was so challenging and difficult. But the article with the black quarterback then starts to focus more on the black quarterback and his inadequacies and shortcomings. So it's like a shifting standard kind of thing. Even when you succeed, you aren't as likely to get as much of the credit. But if you fail, you're going to get more of the blame.
Yeah.
With this subject, one of the questions that comes up in my mind is it still worth the price for African Americans to pursue leadership in the C-suite, because there's only 3 of them?
Well,
is it did any of the writers express that? Because you mentioned about resiliency, but it just seems that the cost is not going, neither financially, emotionally, spiritually. The cost is not going down to pursue this.
Yeah. No, we saw that. And one of the things that we studied, and we looked at who is the largest current employer of Black MBAs today. It turns out it's themselves. It's creating their own businesses. So it's not a company. No one company stands out as like, this is an attractive company. And it's individuals who say, look, I have to have this own self-efficacy, this own self-determination. I'm not going to, necessarily make it on this particular path, this traditional path. So in some ways, what I said, like things are the same as in the past, is this focus on entrepreneurship. I need to own it myself, because the level playing field is not level. There isn't a level playing field. And so I'm choosing this path. And so that's for Harvard MBAs. And that's sort of the elite of the elite choosing that particular path.
Wow. Laura, do you want to add on to that in any way?
No, I think that's, that's the most pertinent insight. It's also worth considering that many millennials and younger workers of all racial backgrounds are less enamored with the C-suite today.
Yeah.
For large corporations, because there's just less trust in corporations, in corporate leadership. So, there are many articles that talk about how we're in a gig economy now. So people are writing about this gig economy as if this is a brand new phenomenon, when in fact, I would say Black workers have been part of the gig economy for hundreds of years. I mean,
lots of years.
Lots of hustlers. You go to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and you see all of the metal works of enslaved Africans who were making pots and beds and other kinds of artifacts and playing music and doing lots of different things to earn money on the side. And in certain circumstances, even doing so to be able to buy their own freedom eventually.
Yeah.
So the gig economy is nothing new for Black workers, nor is the concept of self-determination, entrepreneurship, and business ownership. I think now we're thinking more about, many of the HBS grads, for instance, are thinking about, how do I go from a hustle or a gig to building my own enterprise?
Yeah.
How do I create a version of what Tyler Perry did last week, which is, forget Hollywood, I'm building my own studio, entire studio based in Atlanta, Georgia, which from what I understand is like double or triple the size of the Warner Brothers studios in Southern California or something like that. So I think those are the interesting questions about where we go next. Is they want to be in a C-suite. They want to lead, but they want to build enterprises at scale that reflect their own values and principles.
Why do you feel, each of you, that companies aren't getting it? They're not buying into it. Like the recent reports over the last few years, you hear about the lack of visible minorities in the tech sector.
Yeah.
Why aren't they? Why do you feel they're not getting it or resisting it? Because it would only benefit them.
That's a good question. I mean, because all the data would suggest that it would benefit them. So I think, some of them are well-meaning. say the right thing, don't necessarily follow through. I don't know. I mean, I think, and that's one of the things that we talked about, or some of the authors talked about in the book. Do you have to justify diversity in terms of a business case, or is it a moral case? And it's much easier to make the business case, because you can say, okay, if you have a diverse workforce, you get more creativity, more innovation, you get all of that, and everybody wants that wrapped up in a nice bow and say, yes, if I hire a more diverse workforce, I will get this benefit. And so that's the expectation. But there's also this moral case about access and opportunity and righting wrongs. And this is where the whole affirmative action thing comes in. And that's a harder story for maybe CEOs to swallow, and to feel like I can have a legitimate stand on that, because that means taking a stand, and that means trying to correct some structural inefficiencies or inequalities in the system. That's harder to sell, right? And so when it's just on the business case, then you can limit it in a way, and you can declare victory soon. And I think a lot of organizations are, you see the proliferation of diversity and inclusion. It's not like they're not trying. Everybody has a diversity and inclusion officer, right? But what do they mean by that? And are they actually helping a underserved community, or are they saying, okay, we just care about everybody, and everybody, as I said earlier, that the tent's really wide, and so we're an inclusive work environment, without sort of focusing on specific races or individuals or things of that nature.
Yeah, and a lot of corporations have put a lot of money into different training programs. So Time Magazine ran a piece a couple of days ago about the diversity industry being a multi-billion-dollar industry. So in that way, you could say, oh, a lot of people are getting it, like a lot of people are throwing a lot of money at it. But why isn't this converting into, the kinds of changes that we've been discussing in our conversation tonight? Yeah. And I think, that is a central question. And then that leads us to say, okay, we can go around with a round or two with implicit bias training or unconscious bias training. That's really hot now. People are spending a lot of money bringing in consultants to train entire organizations. Starbucks shut down, an entire day to have, company-wide implicit bias training, which I think may have been automated. They didn't have individual facilitators on all of the sites. It was like a satellite training experience, just like you'd have to do through HR with many other things, like your satellite, online sexual harassment training course that you have to watch and, take your quiz and check the boxes so you can get your employment paperwork signed. So, I mean, there are different ways that people are offering things in the space of diversity and inclusion. The question is, are they really having impact? Like what's not happening in this space that should be happening? And it's a lot harder to start to change the culture and the structures and to build in some metrics and accountability so that everyone is transparent about what's happening and what's working well from a D&I perspective. But also everybody is transparent and open about where some of the disparities may be and where more attention needs to focus.
Mm-hmm. We'll start to wind down here, but something that came up earlier on in our conversation, you had mentioned the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action were white women.
Mm-hmm.
Is it safe to say that the world of race, work, and leadership won't get where it needs to be until white women are given fair representation in the executive workplace?
Say that again.
So I'm just saying, like with affirmative action, you mentioned that white women are the biggest beneficiaries. Right. Can it be said that Blacks or African Americans or Blacks around the world won't get their fair opportunity in the C-suite until white women are given their opportunities in the C-suite?
I don't think it has to be sequential.
I hope not. Yeah.
I hope not either. But it just seems that there's a trend.
But I think
as if we pit it against each other, if we sort of pit them against each other in that way, then people may feel it's an either or and having to advocate for their own interests. I think when we really talk about patriarchy and oppressive practices in organizations, that what we need to center is what's happening around white men.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about how that plays out in terms of disproportionately advantaging or disadvantaging other people in the organization. So white women, by virtue of their more intimate relationships with white men, tend to enter into some of these conversations differently with them around diversity and inclusion and being at the table. Whereas, people of African descent, even a black man versus a white man, they might share their gender and share masculinity, but it's not the same kind of intimacy as being a white woman and having perhaps a white father, a white brother, a white son, and sort of having a different level of insight into and a feeling of shared investment in the viability of the white man's success and career, and seeing oneself as simultaneously advocating for other women. And often white women will say they're advocating for women. They don't generally stand up and say we're advocating for white women. They say we're advocating for women. But even within that, there's a bit of ambivalence between how much power do I personally want to give up, how much power do I want to force my husband's brothers, sons to give up. And so it becomes a particularly complicated analysis. Who ends up being marginalized in the most extreme way when we think about this whole scenario is really the women of color and the Black women. And so in our book, we have several chapters that talk about these intersections of race and gender, but it talks about what it feels like and looks like to be a Black woman operating in this space when you don't have the race or the gender to help you to create more connections with the seat of power. Ultimately, I think our goal is to bring more people to the table. Inherently, that means that some people are going to have to give up some power in some ways, but in the long term, maybe the idealism kicks in, and I think there's actually enough room
for everybody.
For everybody.
Yeah, there is. There's enough for everybody.
The C-suite.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, as we start winding it down, just like to say, what sort of key lessons or take homes you'd like to share with our audience before we let you go this evening?
So I think that the key lesson and from the book, I think there are lessons for individuals and how they're navigating their career, their sense of agency, their sense of purpose. Even though we've talked about some of the sad aspects of the story, I think there's lots of stories of overcoming and a story of perseverance. So I think there's that. Individually, how do I navigate myself? How do I lean into my authenticity? How do I lean into what I need to do well? And I think there are lessons for organizations. So I think if we're going to address this issue, it has to be a collective issue of the individual and the organization. And to the latter point that we were talking about, it also has to be a conversation where the majority, and often white men like myself, are part of the conversation and part of the solution. And it's not a conversation that's an isolated conversation with the disaffected group, but it's a larger conversation that everybody feels a part of. Because unless you get that majority on board in a way that they feel comfortable having these conversations, pushing it forward, being an ally, all of that is critical for the pendulum to swing a little bit more.
So Tony, I'm going to put you on the spot then. What's it going to take to get to that?
I don't know. It's probably going to take, I get asked a lot of time, like, you're a white guy, you're an old white guy. What are you doing talking about this stuff? And what do you have to say? And I think that, I think it's important for the ally community to feel like they can contribute to this. Because if you think about who's in a position of power right now to give opportunities, to provide mentorship, to provide sponsorship, to create a more level playing field. It has to be this broader audience, and I know there are a lot of well-meaning individuals that want to do that. Maybe does it take courage? I'd like to say no, because it doesn't seem that courageous to me. But for to be able to step up, and if you really, as a CEO, as a leader, if you really are leaning into this, creating an inclusive, diverse workforce where everybody can thrive, then that's not going to happen on its own. And thinking that that's going to happen on its own, or appointing a D&I officer and thinking that you've checked the box, that's not enough. And we've seen that now if you look at the numbers of representation in management, senior management, CEO levels. And so the numbers are stark. It's there. You don't have to look that hard.
Laura, anything else you want to add?
There are some incredibly talented individuals with a lot of drive and desire to contribute, and they're just seeking the opportunities to do so. When we frame the problem in that way, just, boil it down to, look, there are people who are saying that they actually want to do more. They want to give more. And they feel that they don't have the opportunities to do so. Like, we should all care about that. Even if we're purely instrumentally focused, we should care about that. But definitely, if we have some concern for the human experience and everyone's growth and self-actualization, we should care about that. We should acknowledge that this is a problem. And we want to create the conditions in which individuals are able to grow and develop and bring their best selves to the work that they're doing for the betterment of society.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Closing remarks by both of you. I'd like to say thank you to Laura and Tony for taking time out of your positive, productive schedule to share with us. And I put in the comments section in Get Vocal the link for the book and all the information behind it, raceworkleadership.com. I'm going to be adventurous and see if I can also put it up on my screen here. And there is the website right there for you, so you can go check it out. Buy the book. Buy the book. It's well worth it, no matter what background you're from.
Yes.
It's important to definitely read it. Have conversations, folks. Very, very important. It's a very important time, because these conversations will set us up for our future, and we want the future to look bright.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I am Dr. Vibe, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show. I'd like to say thanks to everyone who watches live. Luke is saying thanks, Laura and Anthony and Dr. Vibe. So we also have Kinte on. We also had Fraser from Scotland on. We had Claude Diamond on from San Diego on the YouTube platform. And I'd like to say thanks to everyone who watched or listened to this live or on the replay. If you want to find out more information about myself, go to my website, thedrvibeshow.com, and you can catch out everything there. As I say, all the end of my conversations, live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. Sometimes you have to get smaller to get stronger. Block assumptions and then aim higher, aim bigger, aim wider, and aim deeper. God bless, peace, well, faith, and thanks for catching the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.